He had a wife in Paris and another in New York, but his biggest secret was yet to be uncovered. Welcome. Remember to subscribe and activate the notifications. Enjoy. It was supposed to be just another day walking around in the city, but when Amélie saw her father with another family, everything changed. Jonathan Carter was a man of many faces, a chameleon who had learned the art of blending into his surroundings no matter where he was. To those in New York, he was a dedicated family man, a successful investment banker with a picture-perfect life. His wife, Olivia, adored him, and their two young children, Emily and Jack, looked up to him as the best possible father. They lived in a beautiful townhouse in the Upper East Side, the kind with high ceilings and an air of sophistication. The Carters were the sort of family that graced the covers of lifestyle magazines, a perfect image that Jonathan worked hard to maintain. But Jonathan's life in New York was only one half of his reality. Thousands of miles away in Paris, he was Jean-Luc Dufresne, a charming and enigmatic art dealer married to the elegant and cultured Isabelle. Jean-Luc and Isabelle lived in a chic apartment in the 7th arrondissement with their teenage daughter, Amélie, who was the pride of her father's eye. In Paris, Jonathan's life was just as idyllic, filled with gallery openings, weekends in the countryside, and soirees with the city's elite. For years, Jonathan had managed to keep these two lives completely separate, traveling frequently between New York and Paris under the guise of business trips. He had perfected the art of compartmentalization, never allowing the two worlds to collide. His charm, wit, and meticulous attention to detail ensured that neither Olivia nor Isabel had any reason to suspect that they were sharing their husband with another family an ocean away. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of unraveling. And Jonathan's double life was about to come crashing down in ways he could never have anticipated. Jonathan had always prided himself on his ability to anticipate problems before they arose. His job in finance had trained him to think 10 steps ahead, to plan for every possible outcome. But as he juggled his two lives, he began to notice small cracks in his meticulously crafted facade. It started with the little things: a text message sent to the wrong phone, a misplaced airline ticket, a momentary lapse in the details of his cover story. Jonathan dismissed these as minor slip-ups, easily corrected and forgotten. He had been doing this for years, after all, and had always managed to keep everything under control. However, as time went on, the small mistakes began to snowball. Olivia became more curious about his frequent absences, asking probing questions that Jonathan found increasingly difficult to deflect. In Paris, Isabel too began to notice that her husband's explanations for his trips were becoming more vague, his stories less convincing. Jonathan's once airtight alibi was beginning to wear thin. The real trouble began when Jonathan's daughter, Amélie, decided to study abroad in New York. It was an opportunity too good for her to pass up, a chance to immerse herself in the world's most dynamic city, to study at one of its prestigious universities. Jonathan had no choice but to support her decision, even though it filled him with dread. He knew the risks of having his two worlds so dangerously close, but he couldn't find a way to dissuade her without arousing suspicion. As Amélie settled into her new life in New York, Jonathan found himself living on a knife's edge. Every time he walked down the street, he feared running into her, or worse, having her encounter Olivia or the children. His once flawless orchestration of his dual lives was beginning to fray, and he could feel the walls closing in. To manage the growing tension, Jonathan became increasingly paranoid. He developed elaborate schedules and routines to ensure that his two lives never overlapped. He would check and recheck his calendar, obsessively plan every minute of his day to avoid any chance of discovery. But no matter how careful he was, he couldn't control the one thing that threatened to unravel everything: human curiosity. Amélie, independent and inquisitive by nature, began to explore New York with enthusiasm. She loved the energy of the city, its diversity, and its endless possibilities. She would often call her father, Jean-Luc, to share her experiences, never suspecting that he was just a few miles away, living an entirely different life. One day, while wandering through Central Park, Amélie spotted a man who looked remarkably like her father. She watched him from a distance, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The man was with a woman and two young children, all of whom seemed to be laughing and enjoying a day out. Amélie's initial shock gave way to disbelief It couldn't be her father. He was supposed to be in Paris. But the resemblance was uncanny, and as she got closer, her doubts began to fade. Amélie didn't approach the man, choosing instead to follow him discreetly. She watched as he and his family left the park and headed toward a nearby townhouse. Amélie noted the address, her mind swirling with questions and suspicions. She called her father later that night, casually asking about his day. Jean-Luc's response was as expected. He had been busy with work in Paris, nothing out of the ordinary. But Amélie couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Amélie's discovery marked the beginning of the end for Jonathan. The more she observed, the more convinced she became that her father was leading a double life. She decided to confront him, but she needed proof. She began to dig deeper, using her resources as a student in New York to uncover more about the man she had seen in the park. It wasn't long before she found what she was looking for, a man named Jonathan Carter, who bore a striking resemblance to her father and whose life in New York matched the one she had glimpsed. With the evidence in hand, Amélie confronted her father during one of his visits to Paris. She waited until they were alone, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "Papa," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "There's something I need to ask you." Jonathan looked up from his newspaper, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it, ma chérie?" "Who is Jonathan Carter?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Jonathan felt his heart stop. For a moment he was too stunned to speak. His name sounded foreign and dangerous coming from his daughter's lips. He knew there was no easy way out of this, no lie that could cover the truth she had already uncovered. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to buy time, though he knew it was futile. Amélie's eyes filled with tears as she pulled out the documents she had gathered. "I saw you in New York, with another woman, another family. You've been lying to us, to me, my whole life." Jonathan could see the pain in her eyes, the betrayal she felt. He wanted to reach out to her, to explain, but there were no words that could make this right. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "I never wanted you to find out like this," he finally said, his voice hollow. "But yes, it's true. I have another life, another family. I'm Jonathan Carter in New York and Jean-Luc Dufresne in Paris." Amélie recoiled as if he had struck her. "How could you? How could you do this to us, to Mama, to Olivia and the children?" Jonathan had no answers that could satisfy her. He had lived this double life for so long that even he couldn't fully explain why he had done it. It had started as a way to escape, to have more, but it had turned into a prison of his own making. "Amélie, please try to understand," he began, but she cut him off. "No, I don't want to understand," she said, her voice filled with anger and disgust. "You've destroyed everything. How do you expect me to live with this?" With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving Jonathan alone with his shattered secrets. Amélie's confrontation was only the beginning of Jonathan's unraveling. She couldn't keep the secret from her mother, Isabelle, who was devastated when she learned the truth. Isabelle had always trusted Jean-Luc implicitly, never doubting his loyalty or love for her. To discover that he had another family, another life, was more than she could bear. Isabelle filed for divorce immediately, refusing to listen to Jonathan's pleas for forgiveness. She moved out of their apartment, taking Amélie with her, and severed all ties with the man she had once called her husband. In Paris, Jean-Luc Dufresne ceased to exist. In New York, things were no better. Olivia, too, discovered the truth when a private investigator she had hired finally confirmed her worst suspicions. Jonathan had thought he could continue his charade, but once the thread had been pulled, everything unraveled quickly. Olivia was furious, feeling utterly betrayed by the man she had devoted her life to. The image of the perfect family she had cherished was nothing but a lie. Jonathan found himself alone, despised by both of the women he had loved and deceived. His children, once the center of his world, now refused to speak to him. The life he had built with such care and deception was gone, leaving nothing but ruins in its place. As Jonathan's world crumbled, the consequences of his actions began to manifest in ways he had never anticipated. His professional life, once a source of pride, quickly fell apart as well. News of his double life spread like wildfire through both Parisian and New York social circles, leading to scandal and disgrace. His clients abandoned him, and his reputation in the art world was irreparably damaged. In New York, the investment firm where he had worked for years fired him, unwilling to be associated with such a scandal. His assets were frozen as both Olivia and Isabel pursued legal action against him, seeking compensation for the years of deception and betrayal. Jonathan was left with nothing, his once opulent lifestyle reduced to a mere shadow of its former glory. But the most devastating consequence was the loss of his children. Amélie, Emily, and Jack all turned their backs on him, unable to forgive the man who had betrayed their trust. They were his pride and joy, the reason he had worked so hard to maintain his double life. And now they wanted nothing to do with him. Jonathan found himself alone, living in a small, dingy apartment far removed from the luxury he had once known. The silence was deafening, the absence of his family a constant reminder of the life he had destroyed with his greed and ambition. As the years passed, Jonathan tried to rebuild his life, but the stain of his past was impossible to erase. He took on odd jobs, trying to make ends meet, but nothing could fill the void left by the loss of his family and his former life. He had become a ghost, living in the shadows of the man he once was. One day, Jonathan received a letter from Amélie. It was the first communication he had had from any of his children in years. He opened it with trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "Papa, I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you for what you did, but I wanted you to know that I've tried to move on. Mama and I have built a new life, and we're happy. I hope you can find some peace too, even though I doubt it will ever be enough to make up for what you've done, Amélie." Jonathan read the letter over and over, the words a stark reminder of the life he had lost. He knew Amélie was right. No amount of repentance could ever undo the damage he had caused. But her letter, as painful as it was to read, also offered a sliver of hope. Perhaps in time there could be some form of reconciliation, even if it was only in the smallest of gestures. Jonathan spent the remaining years of his life trying to atone for his sins. He volunteered at shelters, donated what little money he had to charities, and tried to help those who had been wronged by others. It was a small penance, but it was all he could do to try and make up for the pain he had caused. In the end, Jonathan Carter died alone, his death unnoticed by the world he had once been so eager to impress. But in the quiet of his final moments, he found a small measure of peace, knowing that he had at least tried to right some of the wrongs he had committed. Jonathan's story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of greed and deception. His children, though deeply scarred by his actions, went on to build lives of their own, determined not to repeat the mistakes of their father. Amélie became a psychologist, specializing in helping those who had been hurt by the betrayals of loved ones. Emily pursued a career in law, inspired by the legal battles her family had endured, while Jack, the youngest, became an artist, channeling his pain and confusion into his work. Though they carried the wounds of their father's actions with them, they also learned from his mistakes. They vowed to live their lives with honesty and integrity, to never let ambition or greed lead them down a path of destruction. And so in the end, Jonathan Carter's legacy was not one of wealth or success, but of caution, a reminder that no matter how carefully we craft our lives, the truth always finds a way to surface, and the consequences of our actions will always catch up with us in the end. As Jonathan's life faded into obscurity, the repercussions of his actions continued to ripple through the lives of those he left behind. While his death might have brought a sense of closure, the scars he had inflicted were deep, and healing was a long and arduous process for both families. The pain of betrayal lingered, affecting not only his children, but also the women he had loved and deceived. In New York, Olivia found herself at a crossroads after Jonathan's death. She had always been strong, capable of handling the demands of being a mother and managing her own career. But the revelation of Jonathan's other life had shaken her to her core. The man she had trusted implicitly, the father of her children, had been living a lie for years. The betrayal was profound, and it left her questioning everything about her marriage and her own judgment. For months, Olivia struggled to find her footing. She withdrew from social circles, embarrassed by the scandal that had rocked their seemingly perfect family. Friends and acquaintances were sympathetic, but there was an undercurrent of gossip that Olivia couldn't escape. She became increasingly isolated, spending most of her time at home, where the memories of Jonathan were inescapable. Emily and Jack, too, were deeply affected. They had lost their father not only to his deception, but now to death, and they were grappling with the complex emotions that came with it. Olivia did her best to support them, but she was dealing with her own grief and betrayal. The three of them became like islands, each struggling to stay afloat in a sea of confusion and pain. But Olivia was nothing if not resilient. Gradually, she began to reclaim her life. She threw herself into her work, finding solace in her career where she could focus on something other than the chaos that had been her marriage. She sought therapy, a space where she could unpack the years of lies and rebuild her sense of self. Slowly, the pieces of her life began to come back together, though they would never fit the way they had before. Emily and Jack also found their paths, though it was a long journey for each of them. Emily, always the more studious and determined of the two, buried herself in her studies and later in her law career. She saw the law as a way to find justice, perhaps even a way to make sense of the injustice she had experienced. Jack, on the other hand, channeled his feelings into art. He found expression in painting, pouring out the emotions he couldn't articulate into bold, raw canvases that spoke to the turmoil within him. For all of them, the shadow of Jonathan's betrayal would always be there. But as time passed, they learned to live with it, to find strength in each other, and to build new lives that weren't defined by the mistakes of the past. In Paris, Isabel also faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life after Jonathan's death. The revelation of his double life had been devastating, not only because of the betrayal, but because it had upended the life she had thought was real. Isabel had always been confident, elegant, the picture of Parisian grace. But beneath that exterior, she was deeply wounded. Isabel retreated from the social scene that she and Jean-Luc had once dominated. The whispers and pitting looks were unbearable, and she found herself unable to face the people who had once been her friends. Even her beloved Paris felt foreign to her now, tainted by the memories of a life that had been a lie. Amélie, who had been the one to uncover the truth, was racked with guilt. She couldn't help but feel responsible for the pain her mother was going through, even though she knew intellectually that the blame lay solely with her father. The bond between mother and daughter was strained, each struggling to cope with their grief in their own way. But Isabel, like Olivia, was strong. After the initial shock and devastation, she began to find ways to reclaim her life. She sold the apartment that had been her home with Jean-Luc, unable to bear living among the ghosts of their life together. She moved to a smaller, more modest place in the Marais, a neighborhood that felt less connected to the life she had lost. Isabel threw herself into her work, taking on more responsibilities at the gallery where she had worked part-time. Art had always been a passion of hers, and now it became a lifeline. She found joy in curating exhibitions, in discovering new artists, and in immersing herself in the beauty of the art world. It was a world that, unlike her marriage, was honest and true. As time passed, Isabel and Amélie began to heal. They leaned on each other, their relationship slowly mending as they shared their grief and began to forge a new path forward. Amélie continued her studies and Isabel supported her, proud of the strong, independent young woman her daughter had become. Though the pain of Jonathan's betrayal would never fully leave them, they found a new kind of strength in each other. Jonathan's double life and its eventual exposure didn't just affect his immediate family. The fallout extended far beyond that, reaching into the lives of many others who had been connected to him in some way. In Paris, the art world was rocked by the scandal. Jean-Luc Dufresne had been a well-known figure, and the revelation of his true identity sent shockwaves through the community. His gallery, once a hub of activity and prestige, suffered greatly. Clients pulled out of deals, and the gallery's reputation was tarnished by association. Even after Isabel took over, the gallery struggled to recover, though her dedication and passion eventually helped to stabilize it. In New York, Jonathan's former colleagues at the investment firm were left reeling. They had known him as a brilliant, if somewhat enigmatic figure, and the revelation of his double life called into question everything they thought they knew about him. The firm had to work hard to distance itself from the scandal, and the loss of Jonathan's clients left a significant financial gap that took years to fill. But perhaps the most profound ripple effect was on those who had looked up to Jonathan as a mentor or a role model. There were young analysts and aspiring art dealers who had admired him, who had sought his advice and followed his lead. For them, the revelation of his deceit was a harsh lesson in the fallibility of those we place on pedestals. Some, disillusioned, left their fields entirely, unable to reconcile the admiration they had once felt with the reality of who Jonathan had been. Others redoubled their efforts, determined to succeed on their own merits, without resorting to the kind of deception that had brought Jonathan down. Of all the people affected by Jonathan's double life, Amélie perhaps struggled the most to find peace. She had been the one to uncover the truth, and the guilt and anger she felt toward her father were compounded by the pain she saw in her mother. Amélie had always been close to her father, and discovering that the man she had idolized was not who she thought he was, left her grappling with feelings of betrayal and confusion. After Jonathan's death, Amélie returned to New York to finish her studies, but she found it difficult to focus. The city that had once felt so full of promise now seemed tainted by the memories of her father's deception. Everywhere she went, she was reminded of him, of the man she had seen in the park, of the life he had lived without her knowledge. Determined to move forward, Amélie decided to take a leave of absence from her studies and travel. She needed distance, both physical and emotional, from the life she had known. She spent months backpacking through Europe and Asia, seeking out places where she could lose herself in the unfamiliar and perhaps find some clarity. It was during her travels that Amélie began to write. She had always been introspective, and now with so much to process, writing became a way for her to make sense of her emotions. What started as a journal soon turned into something more, a memoir of sorts, where she poured out her thoughts on her father, her family, and the life she was trying to rebuild. The writing was cathartic, helping Amélie to confront her feelings and to begin the long process of healing. She wrote about her father as she had known him and as she had discovered him to be. She wrote about the pain of betrayal and the struggle to reconcile the two versions of him that existed in her mind. But she also wrote about her own journey, about finding strength in the midst of heartbreak, and about the new life she was forging for herself. When Amélie returned to New York, she was changed. The travels and the writing had given her a new perspective, and though the pain of her father's betrayal would always be a part of her, she had begun to find a way to live with it. She finished her studies, graduated with honors, and eventually published the memoir she had started during her travels. The book, titled The Man I Knew Twice, became a bestseller, resonating with readers who had experienced their own forms of betrayal and loss. Amélie's journey wasn't just about moving on from her father's deception. It was about finding her own voice, her own identity, separate from the shadow of her family's past. Through her writing, she found a way to transform her pain into something meaningful, something that could help others as well as herself. As the years passed, the memory of Jonathan Carter began to fade from public consciousness. The scandal that had once been the talk of two cities was replaced by new stories, new scandals, and the world moved on. But for those who had been closest to him, the effects lingered, shaping the course of their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. Amélie became a successful attorney, known for her tenacity and her commitment to justice. She chose to work in family law, inspired by the turmoil her own family had gone through. She was driven by a desire to help others navigate the complexities of relationships and to protect those who were vulnerable to betrayal and deception. Her personal experience gave her a unique perspective, one that made her both compassionate and fiercely determined in her work. Jack, meanwhile, continued to pursue his art. His early works, dark and intense, reflected the emotional upheaval he had experienced. But as time passed, his art evolved, becoming more nuanced, more reflective of the healing he had undergone. Jack's paintings began to attract attention, and he found success in the art world, not because of his father's connections, but because of his own talent and vision. Olivia, too, found a new path. She eventually met someone new, a kind, steady man who was everything Jonathan had not been. The relationship was slow to develop. Olivia was cautious, unwilling to rush into anything after the betrayal she had experienced. But over time, she learned to trust again, and she found happiness in a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect. Isabel never remarried, but she didn't need to. She found fulfillment in her work at the gallery and in her relationship with Amélie, which had grown stronger over the years. Isabel became a mentor to young artists, sharing her knowledge and passion with a new generation. She was content, at peace with the life she had built for herself after the storm. Amélie's memoir became a touchstone for many, and she continued to write, exploring themes of identity, trust, and resilience in her subsequent books. She found a calling in helping others tell their stories, and she became a sought-after speaker and advocate for those who had been affected by betrayal and deception. Though the pain of Jonathan's actions would never fully leave them, the Carter and Dufresne families found a way to move forward. They rebuilt their lives, not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it, by using the pain as a catalyst for growth and change. In the end, Jonathan Carter's legacy was one of caution and of learning. His life was a stark reminder of the dangers of living a lie, of the destruction that can come from deception, no matter how carefully it is concealed. But the lives of those he left behind were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the ability to find strength and meaning even in the face of profound betrayal. For Emily, Jack, Amélie, Olivia, and Isabel, the future was not defined by Jonathan's actions, but by their own choices, their own paths. They each found a way to live with the truth, to integrate it into their lives without letting it dominate them. And so the story of Jonathan Carter, the man who lived two lives, became a story not just of betrayal, but of healing, of redemption, and of the power of truth to ultimately prevail. As time passed, the shock waves from Jonathan Carter's double life began to settle, with those affected slowly rebuilding their lives. However, just when the families believed they had uncovered all of Jonathan's secrets, another bombshell hit, this time even more devastating. It began innocuously enough with Amélie, who had become an attorney, receiving a strange phone call from a woman named Sofia Valdez in Buenos Aires. The woman claimed to be searching for her husband, Matthew Alarcón, who had mysteriously disappeared several months ago. Sophia explained that she had recently stumbled upon some documents suggesting that Matthew had connections to New York, which led her to Amélie, whose legal expertise and public profile had caught her attention. Initially, Amélie was confused and dismissed the call as a case of mistaken identity. But something about the woman's voice, her desperation, her insistence, stuck with her. Out of curiosity and a sense of duty, Amélie decided to look into it. When she pulled up records using the name Sophia had provided, what she found shocked her to her core. Matthew Alarcón, it turned out, bore a striking resemblance to Jonathan Carter. Further digging revealed that Matthew had been leading a life in Buenos Aires that mirrored Jonathan's in New York and Jean-Luc's in Paris, right down to a wife, children, and a successful career, this time as a property developer. Amélie couldn't believe what she was seeing. Could her father have possibly led a third life, in yet another country, under yet another name? The possibility seemed absurd, yet the evidence was compelling. Amélie immediately contacted Olivia, and together they flew to Buenos Aires to meet Sophia and uncover the truth. When they arrived, Sophia greeted them warmly, but with an underlying sadness that was impossible to miss. She invited them into her home, a beautiful but modest house in one of Buenos Aires' upscale neighborhoods. As they sat down, Sophia showed them pictures of Matthew, her husband, and their two sons, Mateo and Lucas. The man in the photos was unmistakably Jonathan, though older and sporting a different style and demeanor that was consistent with his supposed life in Argentina. "I couldn't believe it when I found out about New York," Sophia said, her voice trembling. "I thought maybe there was some mistake, but now I don't know what to think." Amélie and Olivia were speechless. The revelation that Jonathan had led a third life was almost too much to process. But as they spoke with Sophia, it became clear that this was no mistake. Matthew Alarcón, like Jonathan Carter and Jean-Luc Dufresne, was another identity carefully crafted by the man they had known as husband and father. The discovery of Sophia and her family in Buenos Aires was only the beginning. As Amélie and Olivia delved deeper into their father's past, they uncovered another shocking truth. There was yet another family, this time in Tokyo. This revelation came about when Jack, now a well-known artist, was invited to exhibit his work in Japan. During his stay in Tokyo, he was approached by a woman named Noriko Tanaka, who claimed to recognize Jack's surname from a business card she had found among her late husband's belongings. Her husband, Brad Sato, had died in a car accident several years earlier, but the discovery of the card had recently prompted Noriko to do some research. To her astonishment, she found images of Jack and his family in New York, and she realized that Brad, her husband, was yet another alias for Jonathan Carter. Noriko invited Jack to her home in Tokyo, where she showed him old photographs of Brad. There he was, smiling with his wife and their two daughters, Yuki and Eiko, looking every bit the devoted father and husband. Jack was floored. The resemblance between Brad Sato and his father was undeniable. It was as if the man in the photos was a version of Jonathan that Jack had never known. One that spoke a different language, wore different clothes, and lived a completely different life in yet another part of the world. Jack's shock quickly turned to anger and confusion. How could his father have deceived so many people across so many lives? How could he have kept it all hidden for so long? The discovery of these additional families in Buenos Aires and Tokyo sent shockwaves through both the Carter and Dufresne families. The revelations transformed what had already been a scandal into a global sensation. The media quickly picked up on the story, sensationalizing Jonathan's multiple lives as if they were the plot of a lurid crime novel. The families involved, Olivia, Emily, Jack, Isabel, Amélie, Sophia, Noriko, and their children, were thrust into the spotlight, their private pain now a matter of public curiosity. For Olivia, Isabel, and Sophia, the situation was unbearable. Each had believed they had uncovered all there was to know about Jonathan's duplicity, only to find that his betrayals were even more extensive than they had imagined. Noriko, meanwhile, was devastated by the realization that her late husband, whom she had mourned deeply, was not who she thought he was. Each woman, in her own way, grappled with the enormity of the deception, the depth of the betrayal, and the ramifications for their children. Amélie, who had already published her memoir about her father's double life, was left reeling by the news. The story she thought she knew was only a fraction of the truth. Her book, The Man I Knew Twice, was quickly reprinted with updates to reflect the new revelations. But Amélie found herself struggling with the idea that there were parts of her father she would never truly understand. The narrative she had built for herself and for her readers was incomplete, and it left her feeling disoriented and lost. The children from these additional families were equally stunned. Mateo and Lucas in Buenos Aires and Yuki and Eiko in Tokyo had never suspected that their father was anything other than the man they had known. The sudden revelation that he had other families and other lives was incomprehensible to them, and they were left to grapple with the knowledge that their father had been living a lie. In the midst of this global scandal, the various families decided to meet. It was an unprecedented and deeply emotional gathering, held in a neutral location in London, where they could all come together to try to make sense of the situation. The atmosphere was tense as Olivia, Isabel, Sophia, and Noriko, along with their children, faced each other for the first time. The women, each with their own unique pain and perspective, found themselves united by the shared experience of being deceived by the same man. The children, too, looked at each other with a mix of curiosity and sadness, realizing that they were connected in ways they had never imagined. The initial meetings were awkward, filled with long silences and tentative conversations. There was no guidebook for navigating a situation like this, no easy way to reconcile the myriad emotions they were all feeling. But as the days went on, they began to open up to each other, sharing stories and memories of the man who had played so many roles in their lives. "I always thought he was such a devoted father," Sophia said one evening, as they all sat together. "He was always there for Mateo and Lucas, even when work was busy. I never imagined he had another life, let alone two more." Noriko nodded. "Brad was the same. He doted on Yuki and Eiko. I thought he was the perfect husband and father. I can't understand how he managed to keep all of this from us." Isabel, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "I don't think we'll ever fully understand why he did what he did. I've stopped trying to make sense of it, but what I do know is that we have to move forward, for our children, if not for ourselves." The women agreed. They couldn't change the past or undo the pain Jonathan had caused, but they could choose how to move forward. They decided to stay in touch, to support each other as they navigated the complex emotions that came with the revelations. They also made a commitment to ensure that their children had the opportunity to build relationships with each other, despite the unusual circumstances. For the children, these meetings were equally challenging. They were essentially strangers, yet they shared a father. The knowledge that they were siblings, connected by blood but separated by continents and cultures, was difficult to process. But there was also a sense of curiosity, of wanting to know more about each other and about the man who had shaped their lives in such profound and deceptive ways. As they spent time together, the initial awkwardness began to dissipate. They bonded over shared stories of their father, comparing notes on his habits, his likes and dislikes, his quirks and his flaws. There was a strange comfort in discovering the similarities between them, as well as the differences. Jack, who had struggled with anger and confusion since learning about the additional families, found himself drawn to Yuki and Eiko. The two girls, though younger, shared his artistic sensibilities, and they spent hours discussing their father's influence on their creative endeavors. Mateo and Lucas, meanwhile, connected with Amélie, finding common ground in their experiences as the eldest siblings in their respective families. Through these connections, the children began to form a new kind of family, one that was unconventional and complicated, but nonetheless real. They didn't know what the future held or how their relationships would evolve, but they were committed to staying in each other's lives, to forging bonds that would help them all heal from the pink ink their father had caused. In the years that followed, the families gradually settled into their new realities. The media frenzy eventually died down, and they were able to reclaim some semblance of privacy and normalcy. The connections they had forged during that fateful meeting in London continued to grow, and they found strength in their shared experiences. Olivia eventually remarried, finding happiness with a man who was kind, honest, and devoted to her and her children. Amélie and Jack continued to excel in their careers, drawing inspiration from their past while forging their own paths forward. Isabel remained single, dedicating herself to her work at the gallery and to supporting Amélie in her writing career. Sophia and Noriko both found ways to move on, focusing on their children and their own personal growth. The children, meanwhile, stayed connected, visiting each other when they could and maintaining close relationships despite the distances between them. They had come to see each other not just as siblings, but as allies, people who understood their unique experiences in a way that no one else could. Amélie, who had initially struggled with the revelations about her father's additional lives, found a new sense of purpose in her writing. She published a follow-up memoir, *The Man We Knew Four Times*, which explored the complexities of her father's deception and the impact it had on all of his families. The book was a critical and commercial success, praised for its raw honesty and emotional depth. In the end, the legacy of Jonathan Carter, or Jean-Luc Dufresne, or Matthew Alarcon, or Brad Sato, was not defined by the lies he told or the lives he destroyed, but by the resilience of the families he left behind. They had been through unimaginable pain, but they had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. Jonathan's story, though tragic and filled with deceit, ultimately became a story of survival, of healing, and of the power of truth to bring people together, even in the most unexpected ways. The families he had deceived had found a way to move forward, to build new lives that were not defined by his actions, but by their own choices, their own strength, and their own commitment to each other. As they continued to navigate the complexities of their intertwined lives, they held on to the knowledge that, despite everything, they had each other. And in that, they found hope for the future, a future where they could create their own legacies, untainted by the shadows of the past. I hope you loved the story. The next video is just a click away, so don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. A big thanks, and see you in the next story.